Hello, I want to welcome everybody. My name is Rich Barlow. I teach drawing and painting here at Hartwick College. So I would like to introduce Andrea Carlson, our visiting artist today. When we first came up with this idea for our lecture series this fall of diverse perspectives, one of the first artists came to mind for me was Andrea Carlson. She is a Native American Ojibwe from Grand Portage, Minnesota. And I first saw her work, we just realized discussing before the lecture here, in her first solo show, which when I lived in Minneapolis, I saw at Sioux Visual Arts. And the work was incredibly mature, graphically powerful. You really, upon seeing it, wanted to understand what was going on with this work. It was really interesting and contemporary looking. And the more you looked at it, you realized that there was all these layers of symbols. There was references from pop culture, from native traditional sorts of imagery, and that all of this was sort of being combined into these very interesting and powerful works, as you will see. So since that time, and that would have been about 2005 or 6, I think, since that time, Andrea has gone on to have an incredibly successful career around the country and around the world. She is collected in museums here in the US, the Walker Art Center, for example, and then the British Museum has her work, as do institutions in Canada, I believe. Andrea knows much more about herself and her work than me, though. So I'm going to have her introduce herself. And like I said, if you have questions during the lecture, type them in chat. And at the end of the lecture, we'll have time for a Q&A. So over to you, Andrea.
Rich, thank you, Rich. That was very flattering introduction. Bonjour, Nindanawe Maganidak, Andrea Carlson, Indigenous Cause. Kageasage Indigo, Mikanak Nindo Dame. Kichio Negaming Nindunjaba, Edash Chikagong Nindunjaba Nungum. Mikanak Nindo Dame, Mikwech Bizandawieg. So, what I have just said to you is the Ojibwe speech protocol. A lot of, when you hear native speakers speak, they will kind of go through an introduction in their Indigenous language. I think it's really important for people living in the colonies and North America to really hear the first languages of this continent. It's a shame, and it's terrible that we can live our lives here without ever having heard an Indigenous language from the very land we live on. So I almost take that on, not to be, my motivation is not to be performative about my identity, but I just think that it's really important and a real privilege for people to be able to hear the language. So I'm going to share my screen, if I can figure that out. Can you guys see my screen? Rick, can you see it? No, okay, let's see. Can you see it now? Okay. So this is my, this is where my family's from. This is my reservation, Grand Portage, Minnesota. If you imagine in your mind, if you can hold the image of the state of Minnesota, there's this little pointy tip over Lake Superior that borders on Canada and Lake Superior. The tiniest tip of that is Grand Portage, and this is what it looks like. This is my homeland. It's full of islands. If you were to look at different areas, not this scene in this picture, but other areas, you see this infinite landscape, or this infinite seascape where you can't see across the entirety of Lake Superior. It would just be you're not capable, your eyes are not capable of looking across the entirety of Lake Superior at that point, at certain points. So this is home. I kind of wanted to, because in the past I've gone through my paintings chronologically to kind of map out my career. But since I've developed a larger body of work, I've noticed other kind of sub groupings within larger within the larger body. So, so I am going to start off with some really early paintings, and I'm going to kind of walk you through a timeline, but I'm going to intersect it with a number of examples that kind of take that away. So the Atsukana paintings I painted while I was in grad school. These are paintings that reference the Atsukana, Gorecha, the Ojibwe sacred stories. There's a character in our storytelling. We're only supposed to tell our stories in the wintertime when the spirits are sleeping. So I'm not going to tell you the stories, but there's a character in our stories, sometimes called a trickster, sometimes called a cultural hero. It kind of depends on what he's up to. In a number of the stories, he's playing with his identity. He's not easy to recognize. He'll often, like on the painting on the left, Benewajid, he has transformed himself into a stump, and the water spirits are testing out that stump to see whether or not it's actually Nanabuju in disguise. And then Nanabuju Wajid, which is on the right, is Nanabuju who's taking a nap, and he has commissioned his butt to watch over his food as it cooks, so it won't be stolen from. In one version, the Dakota people, and in another version, it's wolves. So I kind of, in the trees and the birch trees, I kind of give it both human and wolf-like characteristics of those sneaking up on his food. Anyway, through the course of that story, Nanabuju's butt is unable to wake him up, so he punishes it like we do. So those were paintings that I was developing in grad school because I was learning my language, I was learning the stories, and I was concerned that I couldn't see a lot of representations of my culture in pop culture or out in the world. And I wanted to have visual presence. I didn't want to be invisible, or I was very inspired by the stories, but I wanted to see them. So these are two other examples. Ishitwawan on the left, I didn't put the title on, and then Mashkiki on the right, which is Mashkiki is medicine in Ojibwe. One of the things that's kind of interesting about having kind of seascapes, and it's something that comes up a lot in Ojibwe kind of cosmology or thinking, is that there's these two forces. It's not quite a binary. It's not quite a dichotomy. It's different from those kind of Western concepts. But there's this kind of concept of these two elements, these two forces in balance that complement each other. And so in Mushkiki, I have a thunderbird on the left and a water spirit on the right, and those are the two spirits, the water and like the thunder, the sky, that are holding each other in balance. And the thunderbird is supposed to be generous and loving, but it's sporadic and sometimes terrible. And the Mishipishu is supposed to be menacing or bad, but then at sometimes the most compassionate and saves our lives. So when you think of these two forces at odds with each other, it's something that comes up again and again in my work. In 2016, I was commissioned to do a train wrap for the Green Line in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis and St. Paul are two cities that are close together, and they're connected by this train. But again, I was thinking of these two forces that, I mean, I guess St. Paul would be the menacing one. Minneapolis would be the good. Anyway, just kidding. But that there's these two sides. There's the red, the blue. There's Minneapolis, the St. Paul, but there's this thing that links them. So on one side of the train, I have the thunderbird with the wings, and then on the other side, I have the underwater panther. But I think it's also really interesting, and then it says water is life in both Ojibwe and in Dakota, which are the two major nations also within the Twin Cities. There's all of these twins that come up in Minneapolis and St. Paul, including two major tribes. So I have both Ojibwe and Dakota, very diplomatic, got to tell you how diplomatic I am. I'm so diplomatic. So that's kind of some of these themes that I'm noticing that are going beyond bodies of work. So after I had completed a number of Otto paintings, I was invited more to work with museums. And I was starting to think about, instead of Nana Bourgeois, who plays around with his identity and his people's perceptions of him, I was thinking more about this other character in Ojibwe storytelling, which is the Wendigo, who's the winter cannibal monster who often misidentifies who he consumes. He's able to eat another human because he doesn't see the other human as having humanity, but may see me as like Turtle Clan, because I'm Turtle Clan. He might see me as a turtle, or he might misidentify those he consumes. So I've taken the Wendigo as a metaphor to describe how museums treat Native people. Building up to that series of work, I made a number of works on paper that have objects that you would maybe put identity on. There, I see a lot of things as surrogates for cultural exchange. So I have a German stein in the upper left. I have this holy water stoup from the Minneapolis, from the MIA, the Minnesota Institute of Arts of Minneapolis. Sorry. I've only lived in Chicago 5 years and I'm already forgetting Minnesota. Sorry about that. And then, two other objects which we assign identity to. So like the German stein might look masculine. It has this little German village on it. So I imagine like if you could jump inside the painting, you could then jump into the landscape within the stein. So it's like a landscape within a landscape. The holy water stoup is like another one of those objects where you, if you knew about Christianity or holy water, you might be able to assign that to it. I don't know much about either of those things, but objects will bring a cultural context to them. I also am really interested in like how gender plays out on things that you wouldn't normally think would be gendered, such as teapots and plates and things like that are often domestic and therefore gendered as female. So I like that objects can kind of play around with that identity as well. So in the upper left, Nana Bourgeois is in the story, he's eating the meat out of a caribou skull and he gets his head stuck in the skull. And then there's a series of stories where none of the other characters can recognize who he is because he's almost wearing a skull as a mask. So this idea of like the power of recognition plays out in a lot of my work. So then I was invited to work more in museums. My first museum exhibition was at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And I guess it is Minneapolis, not Minnesota. Anyway, so this is Ishi in the lower right. As he was found emaciated and starved. He's the last of the Yahi people, which I say that, but I also know that it's not true because there's many close relatives to his people group around him. So he was found in Northern California. His family had died. That was when a lot of settlers it was perfectly legal to, at that time, in a settler construct, to kill Native people, and there was lots of massacres. In his case, he was with his family and they had all of their supplies stolen while they were off hunting and gathering other supplies. They came back and some land prospectors had stolen all of their goods and materials that were to get them through the winter. And so his family were not able to get through the winter. The artist, and then, so after he was found all alone and by himself, he then became a museum object. The curator at the Smithsonian, and before that, a curator that worked with the University of California, Berkeley, before it was called that, I think, picked him up and made him into a last of his people museum exhibit. So you can see him on display. and a house that he constructed, and it has signage, you know, of in the exhibition of how he lives. So then the artist James Luna, of course, in the 80s and 90s, and he died in a couple of years ago. But James Luna then took this kind of natives as a static museum object to be put on display, and he put himself on display, which is the artifact piece in the upper right, and then in the lower right, that's James Luna wearing a t-shirt, definitely commenting on Ishi. So I knew going through school in American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, like I was very familiar with museum studies and how museums can be very antagonistic to Native people. So I had that. So then when I started working with museums, and it's a space that already has a narrative baked into it, and it's something that that Native artists are either expected to get over, or it's something that it complicates or it hurts us to be in that space. I will skip past that. That was my section on cultural tourism, but that's almost too hard for me to talk to. And I didn't give you a trigger warning, and that image was pretty disturbing. So in this show at the Art Institute, this is a plate that depicts Fort Snelling, and it was made, the center image, it was made in Hamburg, Germany for US export. It was made in 1864 or 65. It was manufactured just a year after the Dakota 38. And if you don't know who the Dakota 38 plus 2 is, I would write it down and look it up. It was when 38 Dakota men were simultaneously hung at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, or in Mankato, Minnesota. They were imprisoned at Fort Snelling. So this plate is an image of Fort Snelling, and to Dakota people living in Minnesota now, they consider Fort Snelling the concentration camp for their people, or many Native people died. So I imagine like what bullshit people were expected to eat off of this plate, but that plate is in the Minneapolis Institute of Arts collection. So for this exhibition, what I did was I referenced various objects from the Minneapolis Art Institute's collection, then put it into my more mythic landscapes, these landscapes that where I controlled the space. And as I was talking about before, with like jumping into my landscape and then jumping into another landscape within the object, this has that function, but also the museum and my art has that function, where the museum is its own mythic landscape of white walls trying to decontextualize itself or universalize itself. And then I make a space that then has a space within it. I'm gonna go a little faster because I have a million slides. This is another image from that show with artist Jim Denemy. It was a 2-person show. This is a jade mountain that's in their collection. Then about 10 years after that, maybe 9 years after that exhibition, where I was utilizing the museum's collection to put within my landscapes, then in 2016, I worked with a number of artists, we called them stakeholders within the Minneapolis community, to make this grand procession of monstrous object recreations of paintings and objects from the Art Institute, and we buried them in the yard in front of the in front of the museum. So it's in a way, it's in a fake way, it's taking objects out of the museum and putting them into the landscape, when I had been previously putting landscapes within the museum and putting their objects within those. Anyway, I think you can probably figure out what I'm trying to say. I also green screened the backside of these objects, so I could make a film where the objects themselves could be projected onto my fake objects, images of them. So it's kind of hard to tell. While I was editing too, I found out that grass and trees are a green screen. So the film itself ended up being kind of unintentionally trippy. So these are a couple of video stills from how the green screen effect interplayed with the soft objects. Also for that exhibition, which was called LUT, an active reverse incorporation, all of the artists that I worked with, we rewrote wall didactics for the objects. So this didactic is by Gregory Rose, who's an amazing artist in Minneapolis, and he wrote a poem. Each contributor could write what they wanted, whether it was a poem or if they tried to, take on the museum rhetoric and try to write a description of the piece. We also went around the museum and read the existing didactics and out loud. And when you read existing didactics out loud, you often know who the author is, even if you don't know who they are because they don't sign their work. You know how they relate to the object. So one of the things that I remember reading was they kept using the term exotic, from exotic lands like China, and it's to who, the language reflects a positionality, and we were told that many of the wall texts that were up around work at the Art Institute had been written in the 1950s. Not anymore. That year they had rewritten all of the wall texts. So, but as part of this exhibition, we rewrote a number of the wall texts, and this particular one I love because it was the first time in the African collection that the words Black Lives Matter was in that space. So large scale landscapes. I can't get over the idea of this kind of binary, the air and the water, seascapes rather. This piece is in the Art Institute's collection. Again, that you see the term sunshine on a cannibal, still kind of seeing museums as this winter cannibal monster that misidentifies what they consume. They eat and eat and eat to never become satiated. But then at the same time, in that collection, in the belly of the beast, it doesn't really, that consumption takes a level of just misidentifying what they actually have. So this image has a number of, it says in the middle, insert trigger warning here in cases where the subject is also the primary audience. And that is kind of maybe oftentimes when people do displays or representations of a people group, they in their imagined audience might be white, but if someone is to curate or make work or a video or a documentary about another group, and that other group is the ones that actually consume the output, I think that the outer group, the person who put it together that might not be part of the group, I think that they relate differently to their work. I think they explain it differently. If the audience is not the subject, then they might talk about it differently. And so this is to kind of talk about the text is to talk about how we relate to our subjects, depending on whether or not they are the audience. This piece is Ink Babble. Again, this is about stories traveling across landscapes. You have the stacked 10 landscapes stacked. And the kind of the cellular composition of this is if you were to take some celluloid film out of a camera, out of like a movie camera, and you were to look at the cells stacked on each column, if you were to look at a panorama shot, each object would kind of slowly tick down from cell to cell to convey that movement. But then if you were to look at still photography and a panorama shot that it would be really long, the landscape would be exaggerated. So this is like a bifurcated landscape where you have a two-way panorama, a time-based panorama, which is going to be your columns, and then your row is going to be like a static panorama, but it's a two-part panorama shot pulled in two directions. And you can kind of see that one is more time-based and one is more space-based by looking from object to object. And the pig kind of breaks out of the cells, and he's like the zoom pig. And there's different objects in this piece that relate to migrations or the idea of stories moving across the landscape. Here's a single cell from Ink Babel. It's mostly ink on paper. The gray is oil. So for a number of my pieces, the earlier work that I was making, it was about 22 inches tall by about 30 wide. This piece here, Blanket Sphincter, is about 22 inches tall by 30 inches wide. And I liked making work that scale because it seemed like a window, this idea of like jumping into that space. But then the more I was working, like the pieces you just saw, I wanted to make a door. So this is the Tempest and Portage. These are kind of portals to, or rabbit holes into decolonized worlds, into places that aren't settled by any humans. But it's an imaginary space, because you then realize that it's on paper, you see the deckled edges of the paper, and you can't access it. So it's kind of a fantasy decolonized space. So breaking out of the museum, that landscape, in 2016, I was asked to do a commission at the decommissioned Lock and Dam space on the Mississippi River in Minneapolis. It's hard to tell in this map, but the red spot is Spirit Island. And then you can kind of see Upton Island and the Mississippi River. And then there's this line that kind of goes diagonally across the river. That's a bridge. So that island was removed over the course of several decades. It was quarried because it has limestone that was valuable by settlers. And after the Dakota were removed after the War of 1862, it was called Spirit Island because it was a sacred place to the Dakota people. And so when it was being quarried, it was being treated in a very disrespectful way because it was very important. And then about 50 years ago, it was blasted out to make room for the bottom of the ship hulls when the lock system was put in. And a lock, if you don't know what a lock is, it's kind of like an elevator, or at least in this lock is an elevator to go up the falls, up the waterfalls. So what would go into it, it would close off, fill up with water, open up on the other side, and the ship could then go up the waterfalls. So in order to kind of get to that elevator, they removed the island. Here is some of the images from when it was being quarried. Again, it was quarried over several decades, but it's a beautiful, beautiful island. So you can tell in the lower right that it was just this gorgeous, like stratified limestone. So this was my projection into the actual lock. Spirit Island was a sacred place for the Dakota. After several decades of quarrying by settlers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredged the island in 1963 to accommodate boat traffic for the Upper St. Anthony Lock. Today, we imagine this missing place in Dakota, Ojibwe, and English. These are just shots. So the film actually had the Dakota and Ojibwe words scrolling across the space, and then images of the island starting off the largest photographs of it and then getting smaller and smaller as it was taken away. And I see the lock as being actually the coffin for the island. Dakota Makote, which means Dakota land in Dakota. I'm such a diplomatic person. I know how to say like 4 things in Dakota, and I'm so proud of it. So then I'm going to move along to the vor paintings. Vor is, of course, Latin for like to eat, you know, carnivore. You see vor and a lot of things like that. This piece is Long Weekend. I was starting to think of like the cannibal boom genre of filmmaking and how storytelling, how will, you know, Netflix all winter long because it's cold outside, and you know that's how my ancestors used to live. Is you tell stories all winter long, and today our stories are told through films. So I made these almost fake film posters. This one's for Long Weekend, which is 2 films, Long Weekend and Weekend. I was really interested in cannibal genre films because they often depict Indigenous people as their revenge films, where a colonizer or someone will show up amongst Indigenous people and do some terrible atrocity, and then the revenge is that the natives killing the invaders, whatever form they take. So this one is Eaten Alive, Mangiati Vivi. A lot of these films came from Italy too. It was, you know, kind of part of the horror genre coming out of Italy. Cannibal Ferox, Apocalypse Domini. Apocalypse Domini was made not terribly long after Apocalypse Now. And it means apocalypse tomorrow. So the Italians really liked Apocalypse Now, and we're trying to one up it, cut and run. So at this point, I'm kind of making these fake film posters that reference real films, but I'm also looking towards animals and objects that convey violence or certain types of exploitation worked into them or consumption. Cannibal Holocaust. And you can still see like the cartoonish elements of my early work, that these little spirits of the rocks. Cannibal Ferox. So I'm going fast. This stuff's all available online if you want to see. This piece is called Vaster Empire, and it's not about a film per se, but it's about museum collection pieces. So you have the Deal Warrior on the right, and you have that Mayan crystal skull that is some big long con that I won't get into. But this piece showed in England, and it was kind of my anti-British Museum painting, which of course I have work in the British Museum now because there's nothing a museum loves more than being criticized, because it's still about them. So if you want to get into the British Museum, criticize them. They'll love you for it. So the quote at the middle says, "We hold a vaster empire than has been." That's from the Boer War in Africa, and it was a pin that was produced for the Queen's Jubilee. So there's a lot of this like kind of collecting, but also a British nationalism that goes into like history of museums and the curio cabinet. So I did like over 20. I probably did like 30 of these 4 pieces. Maybe I should probably go back and count, but I did quite a bit of these fake. And then you can kind of see that it's a seascape too, that the horizon line goes from image to image. Propagation. So I covered landscapes on the outside, showing outside of museums, showing inside of museums, these faked landscapes. And now I'm starting to become more interested in propagation through printmaking. And I can make an image and then have my identity, have Indigenous identity, grow legs and spread out in multiples. So this piece was produced by High Point Center for Printmaking, anti-retro. You can kind of see on the left, Little Spirit Cedar Tree, which is this twisted up cedar tree that's a sacred site in Grand Portage where my people are from. And then on the right is the Joseph Boyce tree at the Walker Art Center's sculpture park. Has some like a stone out in front of it. And then there's cowboys falling off of their horses, and a horse perpetually falling. Like it will never hit the ground. It's always suspended in the air. So this piece, you kind of have to know, if you don't, that there's the witch tree in it, and you kind of have to know, well, little spirit cedar tree. Everyone kind of colloquially calls it the witch tree. We didn't really have witches, but in order to fear native things and native spirituality, our things are called either devils or witches. So the witch tree, devil's kettle, Devil's Tower. You know a number of these places, I'm sure. Well, if you hear devil or witch or something like that, it's probably a native sacred place. It's a good bet that that's the case. And then this one is Exit, also High Point Center for Printmaking. It has the mica talons and hand forms that were found all along the upper Mississippi River Valley. Those that were produced by ancient Mississippian people. My ancestors would have been included in that group. And then this image is flanked by these bent trees. Native people used to mark our trails through taking saplings and bending them over, tethering them to the ground, and then they would grow with an angle to them, and that would mark off our trails. And they're still all around. There's still some that exist in Illinois, and people find these bent trail markers all over. At the center is, I don't know if anyone has ever been to Wisconsin out there, but there's in Baraboo, Wisconsin, there is a effigy of a man mound. This one's inverted, he's upside down, he has a split head, and his feet are up and his arms is kind of skewed, this image. But if you look up man mound in Baraboo, Wisconsin, you will be absolutely charmed by this effigy. His legs have been cut off by a road that has recently been subsequently been named Man Mound Road. But if you want to find him, it's really easy to find him because of the road that took his legs. Keep going. Also under propagation is the film work that I do, because they can also exist in multiples and in many places at once. So these are 2 stills from 2 films that I've worked on in the past. This is my most recent piece. Just came down at the Berkeley Gallery in Minneapolis, and it's going to be going up. I'll show you the picture. So this is kind of the colorful answer to Ink Babble that I already showed you. But this piece is all about making space for the spaces that Native people make for ourselves. It will eventually, these are renderings, this isn't real, but since you guys are in New York, if you go to New York City, at the end of Highline, the Highline where the Whitney is, the Whitney has commissioned this piece for reproduction to be on that billboard. So anyway, but that opens in February 2021. So if you want to see this in real life, even though these are fake renderings, you'll have that privilege coming up shortly. I'm gonna see what I'm in for time, but let's see. I think that's it, and I think we have 15 minutes. Let's see. Hi.
Hi. So as I said at the beginning, to anyone who wants, if you have questions, type them in the chat or say that you have one, and then we can call on you to ask that question. I was curious, Andrea, the last piece, do you know how long that will be installed on the Highline?
Oh, September. So it'll go up in like February. It will go up the end of January and then be up, but announced in February, but then up until September. Okay. So it'll be next summer.
Hopefully we'll have a chance to get there and see it. We often take students when we are allowed to meet together and go places together. So hopefully we'll be able to by then.
Yeah, they haven't announced it yet, but tomorrow, I found out tomorrow they're announcing it. And then there'll be a bigger announcement closer to that date, closer to February.
it occurs to me too, this isn't really a question, but if we were in person right now, if we were in our lecture hall, right outside the door to our lecture hall, we have one of those Joseph Beuys trees and rocks too. So our students can go and see what you were talking about that the Walker has in their sculpture garden.
Well, and the ones that the Walker had, I think they might have been put up in like the 90s. And Todd Boakley, who represents my art, the Boakley Gallery in Minneapolis, was one of the people that planted it. So like when I made it and showed it to him, I'm like, oh, it's a little love letter to Todd Boakley. But I don't think he tells anyone that. I think he's like, you know, he doesn't. I've also written an essay. If y'all are interested, it's called Let's Talk About the Universal White Male Artist. And I am not very kind to Joseph Beuys. He was a con man. Yeah, I think he was a con man. I think he was a cult leader. And that usually really interests me and cracks me up. But I don't take him terribly seriously. But anyway.
So do we have any questions from the audience or students?
Are they all forcibly muted?
Well, I think they might still be forcibly muted, so maybe Leah needs to allow for people to unmute. But again, you can type your questions or comments or just I have a question in the chat and we'll turn it over to you.
And you're all able to unmute yourself now.
Thanks, Leah.
I have a question. Do you think you used what is it called, a thing that like puts out an image on a wall, a projector? Do you think you'll do more artwork where you're like mixing multiple like types of medias together to create like a masterpiece, like using a projector on top of a pre-made already like artwork? Like, do you think you'll be doing more of that, or like expand on it, maybe like use more than 2 or like 3 or 4?
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of incorporating both projection and kind of two-dimensional painting. When I was doing the films with the green screen effect, I think it would be really fun to do a painting with green screen sections of it and then make films of paintings too. I don't do a lot of sculpture other than the props that I made for that film, but I'm also planning on expanding the work into the third dimension. I like to play with dimensionality. If you think of, when you think of like Ink Babel or Red X, that has all those panels, I'm kind of pulling apart dimensions, but still in 2D work. So I'd love to expand into the third dimension and utilize more time. And you know, with projection, time is kind of baked into it. So yeah, I think that would be a really fun avenue. I don't ever want to plateau. And you know, a lot of artists, they figure out that one trick and then they do that one trick forever. I don't ever want to be that artist. I want to, like, everything that I make, I want to look at it and scrutinize it and then challenge myself to do the next harder thing, the thing that I thought would be impossible. But I think there's so much room for this work to grow into sculpture and into more video and to combine, to blur those categories. That was a great question. Inspiring.
I have a question, maybe along those lines. I was really interested in your kind of multi-panel, you called them cells, the ones specifically the stories. You said stories moving across the landscape with, I think it was a buffalo, and really long, skinny landscapes that kind of stacked up. And usually you see film stills like left to right, and yours sort of were stacked up bottom to top. And I was wondering if that is like preliminary stages to your filmmaking, or if you think of those as films, or you really just want us to read it sort of as one big image. I'm interested in sort of the tension between the movement, but also stillness of the painting.
Yeah, so you know, when you go into museums and galleries and like nothing holds you for even a second. Like you kind of see it and you get it, you see it, you get it, you see it, you get it. I wanted to make something that was like undeniable, that you couldn't just glance at it and I've seen it before and walk off. I wanted it to hold you and like consume you for a minute. Like if it's larger than your body, you might feel intimidated by that scale, or that it's consuming you or subsuming you. But I wanted to put this like minutia detail in the work, where even though it was big and you had to step back to see the whole pattern, that you would be sucked into the detail. Like you would want to be like, what am I actually looking at? Because when you look at the overall pattern, you kind of miss out on what it is that you're actually looking at. So I see people, when they see it, they do that back far away thing, and then they come in close and they try to get as close as possible. And there's something really satisfying as far as being an artist to do that to a person, to have them want to investigate the work. As far as the dimensions and the kind of cellular patterned use of repetition, when I'm just like so intrigued by seascapes and seashore. I grew up walking on Lake Superior, and you hear the rhythm of those waves. You walk along the beach, you hear your footfalls, and you get into this kind of trance state walking and hearing the shore, and then your mind wanders past that, and you know, like I always come up with like a lot of ideas in that kind of walking on the shore space, and when you look across a horizon line that you can't see the other side of the lake, when you just see this infinity horizon line and you can't imagine the end, I see that as being like, that's what infinity would look like. It would look like, even though we know that it's not infinite, we live on one landscape. We live on a unified sphere. So spinning around that sphere, it actually is just one landscape that we all live on. And it is kind of an infinity landscape. You could just kind of, you know, as far as topologically speaking. So I'm just kind of really drawn into that in kind of a just kind of spiritual way. So
Thanks.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions coming in chat. One of our colleagues had to leave early and just wanted to say thank you. That was a very instructive and provocative work. We have another student saying, I don't have a question, I'm just in awe. I learned so much. I live in Michigan when I'm not at Hartwick, and almost everything is named based off of Native tribes, but it feels like this really opened my eyes to their impact in my local community versus how little actual representation Native people really have today. Thank you. So just passing that on. And then the first of the questions we have from a student here is, what was one of the reasons you became an artist?
I mean, this is not a very like glamorous answer, but my dad is an artist, and ever since I can remember when I was really little, there was a lot of like it was just really important to become an artist. It just seemed like my sisters didn't take it up. My older sister is a NICU delivery, like a nurse for neonatal intensive care. Like she has a really intense job. And then my little sister is a therapist, and they do very important work. And I'm the one that I'm kind of the two sisters, I'm the sister that kind of chased down art and philosophy, and but it was something that I think my family valued so incredibly much. There's artists in my family going all the way back, even if it was, you know, a previous time, selling beadwork and selling diamond willow kind of tchotchkes on the side of the Highway 61 up in Grand Portage. So I think I was really lucky to have family that really just really not only supported it, but was romantic about being an artist. So I know a lot of artists don't have that from their families, and I don't think I could have. I don't think I could have pursued it if I didn't have, you know, if I didn't have that kind of support.
Okay, and we have another question. Started off saying, great work. Thank you for telling us about it. You mentioned that museums love collecting work that is critical of them. Do you worry that entering a collection might blunt the pointed institutional critique that a work of yours has the potential to deliver? Any examples of proposed projects that a museum didn't realize because they found it too controversial?
Well, I mean, I don't know what this is because I didn't anticipate it, but you know, when I was critical of museums, I was almost blown back that there were curators that were like, yes, you're saying what we wish we could say, but from our positionality, we might not be able to say what you're able to say as an artist. So there was a lot of curatorial support for some of the criticism, but then there was also some curators that did not like it. And they were like, what you're talking about, all of your museum criticism is dated and old, and we're beyond that now. We're beyond the modernist elements of you know, exploitation and we're not, you know, like I was told to my face, like museums are not colonial. They came from colonization, but they're not colonial anymore. And that is not true, but that was, you know, years ago. And I always kind of wonder if those curators still think that way, or if they, because I've never gotten an apology. So I think it can go both ways, but a lot of the curators that I work with love the conversations about, they love discussing museums because that's where they work and occupies their time. But it also just seems to be like museums are self-interested. Like, yeah, they want a conversation about themselves. And so then I don't want to, as an artist, I don't want to do the chores. I don't want to like, do us now. Oh, you did that criticism on that museum, now do us. Like, I don't want it to be like a gimmick. You know, there's you know, a lot of research and time and effort that goes into why I choose what I choose to work with, and I don't want to chase around chores with museums either. But I do think that the more and more the longer and longer I've worked, the more I've seen museums actually change and become willing to discuss their air out their dirty laundry. But I mean, I don't know. So I think it can go both ways. I think people can cut you off, and I think people can really lean in and embrace it. But I definitely I'm aware of the psychology of museum motivation and desire, and I try to you know, sniff it out first. But yeah, it's such a weird situation to be in with museums. If you're talking about like how museums display objects and display art, and how museums tell stories for Native people, or if museums are actively holding our ancestors' bodies as they do, you know, like it's just a really odd place for natives to be in and participate in. And every museum wants to like decolonize this space, and they, you know, they'll act as though they do. They all want a land acknowledgement statement, and you know, for like, I don't know. So it does put me in a really, I think for a lot of Native artists, we're sometimes hurt by museums, and I think decolonization, at the root of decolonization, it should be a place. I think decolonization means, because you can't go back in time, that's not what it means. I think decolonization at its core needs to be a healing place for Native people. It needs to be about our health and our, you know, robust, like our thriving health. And if we're told that, you know, we need to decolonize our minds, but we're in a space that actively hurts us, we can't heal in that space. We have to make the actual things that hurt us. We have to take that away first before decolonization can happen. And yes, a lot of ethnographic museums still have our bodies and our ancestors, even though it's entirely illegal for them to possess these things.
So we have a couple of comments about it, saying that you seem like you're tired, and I know you were in Zoom all day, so I hope that this is okay to go a few more minutes. And the comment continues: the way humans treat other cultures and display them is more than messed up and unhuman. I would agree with that. I had a question myself. I remember seeing in your work when the cannibal movie sorts of things started coming in, and at the time, you know, it took me a while to decode what that was about. And I understand you're talking about cannibalizing culture in the museum. I had also always assumed that it was also about the sort of, you know, racist underpinnings of these movies and how they're treating the native, the scary native. But you also were talking about them as revenge films, which is that how the filmmakers see them? I don't watch cannibal horror movies. So.
I mean, they're all revenge horror, and I wouldn't suggest watching them. Some of them are really, like, really gross, but they're all kind of set up. They're all the same story. They're all like either an oil prospector or a cult leader or a Christian missionary or you know, some exploiting, you know, Western element will come into either Africa or Asia, like the or South America, and do something terrible to the natives, and then the end of the film, the crew gets totally cannibalized. So they're all the same film, every single one of them. There's no, like, it's just like different characters but the same film. But I think it's really interesting because when I think about like cultural cannibalism, this idea of eating the other and then possessing it, to me it seems like it's cultural assimilation, you know, where a colonial culture comes in and tries to consume the natives, but also like culturally assimilate. Now you're going to wear our clothes and you're going to speak our language and you are going to become part of our body. You're going to become American. You are going to, you know, assimilate culturally to our ways. And so I see that as also, you know, I see that as almost being cannibalistic. A lot of people that have written about my work will talk about cultural appropriation as opposed to cultural assimilation. I think the metaphor is almost better for cultural assimilation than appropriation. But I mean, I think that maybe both elements are there. It's still about consuming the other, magicking oneself with the other. That happens a lot in the art world. There's like this new modernist push, I think, happening right now in contemporary art where everyone's doing that, like, kind of primitivism again, and it's, you know, it's really upsetting to Indigenous people. But, and not to mention all of the non-Native artists that have really keyed into things like water is life, and, you know, the contemporary Native movements. There's a lot of artists that are taking this on and displacing Natives in these places that are in museums and positions that, you know, have a layer of power to them and agency. So yeah. I love that someone's like, oh, she looks tired, let her go to bed.
Well, I mean, as I said, we do know you've been Zooming all day, and we know how tiring that can get. We are right at 7 o'clock, and so that was 15 minutes for questions. Unless anyone's got any follow-up questions at this point, I think we should wrap it up. I want to thank you for a fantastic presentation and talk. I think as a couple of comments let you know, I think this was probably eye-opening for a lot of students, a lot of people seeing and hearing about things that are unfamiliar, and so I think that's fantastic.
Well, thank you so much.